a scuffed pink sneaker. That's what did it. Not a bleeding heart. Not some twisted sense of biker justice. Just a grown man staring at a kid's shoe in the dirt, realizing the world was a sick joke, and deciding to punch the punchline in the teeth. Grease under the fingernails never really washes out. It just settles into the grooves, a permanent tattoo of blown gaskets and stripped bolts. Garrett dug a flathead screwdriver into the grit beneath his thumbnail, sitting on an overturned milk crate in the suffocating heat of a Reno afternoon. The asphalt of the Desert Rose Motel parking lot was soft enough to leave boot prints. The air tasted like ozone, melting tar, and the faint, bitter tang of exhaust from the nearby interstate. He didn't look like a savior. He looked exactly like what the heavy leather cut draped over his motorcycle seat proclaimed him to be, a Hell's Angel. His beard was thick and tangled, threaded with early gray. A jagged scar hooked over his left eyebrow, pulling the skin tight. He wasn't here to rescue anyone. He was here because the motel manager didn't ask questions. The cops rarely patrolled this far past the city limits, and his shovelhead needed a complete teardown after a rough run from Bakersfield. 3 doors down, in room 114, lived a woman named Roxanne. Garrett knew her name because she screamed it into a burner phone at least 3 times a day. Roxanne was a cyclone of cheap gin, stale menthols, and desperate, losing bets. She was thin, but not the healthy kind of thin. Her skin had the grayish-yellow pallor of someone who lived exclusively under the fluorescent lights of off-strip casinos, breathing recycled air and praying to the dead screens of video poker machines. And then there was the kid. Her name was Maisie. Garrett had gleaned that from the rare, sharply hissed reprimands that drifted through the thin walls. Maisie was maybe 6 or 7. It was hard to tell. She wore clothes that hung off her narrow shoulders, faded graphic tees advertising summer camps she'd never been to, denim shorts with frayed hems. She didn't speak. Not once in the 2 weeks Garrett had been rebuilding his engine had he heard the kid laugh, cry, or talk. She just existed, a quiet little ghost hovering at the edges of her aunt's erratic orbit. Garrett didn't care. That was his rule. The world was a wood chipper, and if you spent your life trying to pull people out of the blades, you only ended up losing your own arms. He had done his time in lockup. He had broken bones and collected debts for men whose names commanded silence. Morality was a luxury he couldn't afford. But sensory details have a way of invading your space, no matter how high you build the walls. He noticed the way Maisie flinched when a car door slammed. He noticed the purple-yellow smudge of a fading bruise on her right calf, partially hidden by a sagging tube sock. He noticed the smell that wafted from room 114 when the door opened, a sickening blend of ammonia, spilled vodka, and unwashed laundry. Today was worse than usual. The desert wind had picked up, blowing a fine grit into Garrett's eyes as he wrestled with a stubborn spark plug. Down the walkway, Roxanne was spiraling. She had stumbled out of a cab 20 minutes ago, her mascara smeared into dark, hollow rings around her eyes. She smelled like a 3-day bender and sour panic. Her hands shook violently as she dug through her oversized faux leather purse, dropping keys and crumpled scratch-off tickets onto the concrete. "Useless piece of trash," she muttered, kicking a stray soda can. Maisie had been sitting on the concrete curb, drawing in the dust with a dried-up twig. When Roxanne approached, the girl instantly froze. She didn't look up. She just made herself smaller, pulling her knees tight against her chest. "Get up!" Roxanne snapped, her voice cracking with a manic, frayed edge. "I said get up. Don't just sit there looking stupid. You're bad luck." "I swear to God, you're the reason I lost. You gave me that look this morning." Garrett cranked the handle of his socket wrench. Click, click, click. He focused on the cold steel in his hand. "Not my problem." Roxanne grabbed the collar of the girl's oversized shirt, hauling her to her feet with a sudden, violent jerk. Maisie's small sandals scraped against the pavement. She didn't make a sound. She didn't cry out. She just hung limp, absorbing the rough treatment with the terrifying apathy of a child who was utterly used to it. Inside, Roxanne shoved her toward the battered green door of room 114. Garrett wiped his sweating forehead with a rag-stained black. He turned the volume dial on his portable radio, letting the heavy bass of a classic rock station wash over the gravelly courtyard. He bent back over the motorcycle. He tightened a bolt. He checked a valve. He breathed in the familiar, comforting scent of heavy grease. For 10 minutes, there was nothing but the radio and the wind. Then, the screaming started. It wasn't a child's scream, it was Roxanne. Her voice was shrill, unhinged, tearing through the thin drywall of the motel. "Where is it? Where's the envelope?" "I know, I left a 20 on the counter." "Did you take it? Did you steal from me?" Garrett paused. He squeezed the wrench in his hand. The metal bit into his calluses. "I didn't take it," came a tiny, trembling voice. It was the first time Garrett had heard the girl speak. It sounded like dry leaves rustling. "Liar!" Smack. The sound was sharp, wet, and echoing. It wasn't the sound of a hand hitting a clothed backside. It was the unmistakable, sickening slap of a heavy palm striking a small face. Garrett closed his eyes, his jaw muscles feathered. "Mind your business, Garrett." "You ruin everything," Roxanne's voice escalated, morphing into a guttural shriek. "You're just like your worthless mother. You hear me? A leech. A stupid, useless leech." There was a crash. Glass shattering against a wall. A heavy, blunt thud that rattled the cheap aluminum window frames of the adjacent rooms. Then, the worst sound of all. Silence. Not a whimpering silence. Not the suppressed sniffles of a crying child. It was a heavy, dead, suffocating quiet. Garrett opened his eyes. He dropped the wrench. It clanged loudly against the asphalt. He didn't reach for his leather cut. He didn't grab his keys. He just stood up, his heavy boots crunching against the loose gravel. He walked toward room 114, the desert heat pressing down on his shoulders, his pulse beating a slow, dangerous rhythm in his throat. The door to room 114 was cheap, hollow-core wood, bloated at the bottom from years of monsoon rain. Garrett didn't bother knocking. He didn't announce himself. He just lifted his right boot and drove the heel flat into the space beside the doorknob. The wood splintered instantly. The deadbolt tore through the cheap frame with a loud crack, and the door slammed open, rebounding off the interior wall. The stench hit him first, a wall of humid, foul air, old garbage, cheap gin, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. The room was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single lamp. The carpet was a stained, matted brown. Trash was everywhere, fast food wrappers, crushed cigarette packs, dirty clothes. Roxanne was standing in the center of the room. She was holding a heavy, glass ashtray. Her chest heaved, her hair falling in greasy strands across her face. She spun around, her eyes wide, blown-out pupils swallowing her irises. "Who the hell are you? Get the hell out of my room!" she screamed, taking a step backward. Garrett didn't look at her. His eyes went immediately to the floor. Maisie lay near the edge of a stained mattress. She was sprawled out on her back, one arm twisted at an awkward angle. Her eyes were closed. A thick, dark stream of blood was pooling from her nose, tracking across her pale cheek and soaking into the collar of her faded t-shirt. Her scuffed pink sneaker was half off her foot, resting in a puddle of spilled liquor. She wasn't moving. Her chest wasn't rising. Garrett felt a cold, jagged spike of adrenaline punch through his ribs. It wasn't a heroic feeling. It felt like nausea. It felt like acid burning the back of his throat. "I said get out!" Roxanne shrieked. She raised the glass ashtray, stepping toward him. "I'll call the cops! You hear me, you biker trash?" Garrett moved. He wasn't graceful. He didn't use martial arts. He moved with the raw, brutal efficiency of a man who had survived 100 bar fights. He closed the distance in 2 massive strides, his left hand shooting out to grip Roxanne's throat. He didn't squeeze to kill, but he squeezed hard enough to choke off her scream. He drove her backward, his momentum carrying them both until her spine slammed against the faux wood paneling of the wall. The ashtray dropped from her hand, shattering on the floor. Roxanne clawed at his arm, her acrylic nails digging deep into his skin, drawing hot lines of blood down his forearm. Garrett didn't flinch. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. He could smell the sour decay on her breath. "If you make another sound," Garrett's voice was a low, gravelly rasp, barely above a whisper, "I will break your neck. Nod, if you understand." Roxanne's eyes bulged. She stopped scratching. She gave a frantic, jerky nod. Garrett shoved her away, letting her slide down the wall until she hit the floor. She curled into a ball, gasping for air, whimpering. He turned his back on her, dropping to his knees beside the little girl. The linoleum stuck to his denim jeans. He reached out with hands stained black from motor oil and calloused from decades of riding. His thick fingers were clumsy, shaking slightly as he pressed 2 fingers against the side of Maisie's small neck. He waited. 1 second, 2 seconds. There. A pulse. But it was fast, thready, like the frantic beating of a dying bird's wings. Her skin was freezing cold despite the stifling heat of the room. "Hey," Garrett murmured, his voice softer than he knew it could be. "Hey, kid, wake up." He tapped her cheek lightly. Nothing. He brushed her matted hair back from her forehead. His fingers met a massive, soft swelling above her left temple. The skin there was already turning a deep, angry purple, a skull fracture. He knew what a brain bleed looked like. He'd seen Mother take a crowbar to the head in Sturgis. This kid was bleeding inside her skull. She was slipping into a coma. Panic, foreign and sharp, clawed at Garrett's chest. He didn't do hospitals. He had a warrant out of Maricopa County for an aggravated assault charge. If the flashing lights showed up here, he'd be going back to a 6x8 cell. The smart play was to walk away. He had stopped the beating. He could walk out, fire up the shovel head, and be across the state line by midnight. He looked at the blood on her pink sneaker. He looked at the way her tiny, fragile fingers lay limply on the dirty carpet. He cursed softly, a foul, bitter word that tasted like defeat. Garrett reached into his back pocket and pulled out his heavy leather wallet. He dug out a prepaid cell phone. He dialed 911. Desert Rose Motel, he barked into the receiver the second the operator answered. Room 114, 7-year-old girl, unconscious, head trauma, she's dying. Get an ambulance here now. He tossed the phone onto the mattress without waiting for a reply. Behind him, he heard the rustle of fabric. Roxanne was trying to crawl toward the broken door. Garrett stood up slowly. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly dense. He walked over to the motel phone, sitting on a rickety nightstand, yanked the cord out of the wall, and wrapped the thick wire around his hands. Roxanne looked up, her face twisting in pure terror. "Please," she sobbed, the gin sweating out of her pores. "Please, it was an accident. I just snapped." She wouldn't listen. Garrett didn't speak. He grabbed her by the wrists, crossing them roughly in front of her. She fought, kicking her legs, but she was weak, fueled only by panic. He bound her wrists tightly with the phone cord, securing it with a brutal knot. He grabbed a dirty rag off the floor, something smelling heavily of bleach, and shoved it roughly into her mouth, tying a ripped piece of a pillowcase around her head to keep it in place. "The cops are coming," Garrett said, his voice dead flat. He looked down at the pathetic, tied-up woman. "They're going to take you away, and if by some miracle they let you out, I know what you look like." He walked back to Maisie. He didn't want to move her and make the spinal or head injury worse. He just took off his heavy leather cut, the one bearing the winged death's head patch that he valued more than his own life. He folded it carefully and draped it over the little girl's freezing, motionless body, covering the bruises, covering the blood. The wail of sirens cut through the desert wind, distant but closing fast. Garrett took one last look at the room. He wiped his greasy hands on his jeans. He stepped over the splintered door frame, walked out into the blinding Nevada sun, and didn't look back as he headed toward the highway on foot. Gravel crunched under the heavy soles of Garrett's boots, each step a slow, deliberate strike against the earth. Heat radiating off the asphalt blurred the horizon, turning the long stretch of Interstate 80 into a shimmering, watery mirror. He walked on the narrow shoulder, the violent rush of air from passing 18-wheelers threatening to pull him into traffic. He didn't flinch. He just kept his head down, staring at the white line. His back felt unnaturally cold. For 15 years, the heavy leather cut had been his second skin. It was armor. It was an identity. Without it, the desert sun beat down mercilessly on his faded black t-shirt, clinging to the sweat pooling between his shoulder blades. To leave his colors behind was a violation of the club's most sacred law. Men had been beaten half to death for losing their patch. But when he had looked down at the little girl's shivering, broken frame, the leather had come off his shoulders before his brain could even process the consequence. It was a raw, stupid reflex, a glitch in the cynical machinery of his survival. 4 miles down the highway, the rusted neon sign of a truck stop flickered against the harsh daylight. Patsy's 2-4, Our Diner. Garrett pushed through the heavy glass door. The bell above it chimed, a cheerful, obnoxious sound that felt entirely out of place. The air conditioning hit him like a physical blow, raising goosebumps on his bare, tattooed arms. The diner smelled like burnt filter coffee, industrial pine sol, and the greasy, comforting aroma of fried hash browns. He slid into a booth in the far back corner, facing the entrance. The red vinyl seat was patched with strips of duct tape. He placed his massive, grease-stained hands flat on the Formica table, staring at the deep, angry scratches Roxanne had left down his left forearm. The skin was inflamed, the blood dried into dark, crusty tracks. A waitress with tired eyes and a bleached blonde updo walked over, dropping a heavy ceramic mug on the table. She didn't ask what he wanted. She just filled it with pitch-black coffee. "You look like you walked through a meat grinder, honey," she said, her voice raspy from decades of cheap cigarettes. Her name tag read, Joanne. Garrett didn't look up. "Just the coffee. Leave the pot." Joanne sighed, set the glass carafe on the edge of the table, and walked away. Garrett wrapped his hands around the mug. It was scalding hot, but he didn't care. He needed the grounding burn. He took a sip. It tasted like battery acid and copper. He chewed on the inside of his cheek, his mind replaying the sickening thud of the glass ashtray, the heavy silence that followed, the frantic bird-like pulse fluttering against Maisie's throat. Above the pie display case, a bulky CRT television hummed, tuned to a local Reno news station. The volume was low, fighting a losing battle against the clatter of silverware and the low hum of the refrigerators. Garrett's eyes locked onto the screen. The camera showed the familiar, dilapidated exterior of the Desert Rose Motel. Yellow police tape was strung across the walkway, snapping violently in the wind. Red and blue lights painted the concrete courtyard in harsh, rhythmic flashes. Two paramedics were wheeling a small stretcher out of room 114. The shape beneath the white blanket was terrifyingly small. Garrett's jaw tightened, the muscles feathered under his thick beard. The broadcast cut to a harried-looking reporter standing near the highway edge. The closed captions crawled across the bottom of the screen. 7-year-old girl airlifted to Washoe Medical Center, critical condition, severe head trauma. Then the camera panned. A uniformed officer was walking out of the motel room, carrying an evidence bag. Inside the clear plastic, folded neatly, was Garrett's leather cut. The winged death's head patch was pressed against the plastic. Clear as day, Garrett swore softly, a single venomous syllable. The door chime rang. Garrett's eyes snapped to the entrance. 2 Nevada State troopers walked in. Their tan uniforms were crisp, their heavy leather duty belts creaking as they moved. They took off their wide-brimmed hats, wiping the sweat from their foreheads, and sat at the counter. "Coffee, Joanne," the taller trooper said, "and whatever pie isn't stale." Garrett froze. He was a wanted man in Arizona. He had no ID, no vehicle, and he was sitting in a diner 2 miles from a brutal crime scene, looking exactly like the kind of man who belonged in a police lineup. If they ran his prints, he was doing 10 years, minimum. "You guys look busy," Joanne said, sliding 2 mugs across the counter. "Domestic at the Desert Rose," the shorter trooper grunted. "Messy one. Aunt beat her niece half to death, but someone else was there. Kicked the door off the hinges, tied the aunt up with a phone cord, and left a biker vest on the kid." "A biker?" Joanne asked, pouring the coffee. "Did he do it?" "Doubt it," the tall one replied, stirring sugar into his mug. "Aunt was high on something, screaming that a giant nearly ripped her head. Kid's in a coma. If she wakes up, maybe she tells us. If not, homicide detectives are picking up the patch. They'll run the DNA on the sweat." Garrett didn't breathe. His heart slammed against his ribs, a heavy, suffocating rhythm. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against a crumpled $20 bill. He pulled it out, flattened it on the table beneath the coffee mug, and stood up. He didn't run. Running draws the eye. He walked with agonizing slowness toward the back hallway, pushing through a swinging wooden door marked restrooms. He bypassed the men's room entirely, hitting the heavy metal crash bar of the fire exit. The alleyway behind the diner smelled of rotting garbage and hot dumpster metal. Garrett stepped out into the blinding sun, the door clicking shut behind him. He was a ghost again. But as he started walking toward the dusty foothills, he realized something that made his stomach twist into a cold, hard knot. He didn't want to be a ghost. He wanted to know if the kid was going to wake up. Rust has a smell. It's dry, metallic, and catches in the back of your throat like old blood. Garrett sat on the tailgate of a gutted 1980s Ford pickup, turning a heavy socket wrench over in his bruised hands. The salvage yard was a sprawling graveyard of twisted steel and shattered safety glass, tucked away on the industrial edge of Sparks. Stray dogs barked behind the chain-link fence, their warnings swallowed by the roar of airplanes taking off from the nearby runway. It had been 3 days. 3 days of sleeping on a stained mattress in the back office of Hank's auto yard. Hank was an old acquaintance, a guy who dealt in cash and didn't ask why a Hell's Angel was suddenly walking around without his colors hiding from the sun. "You're an idiot, Garrett," Hank said, stepping out of the corrugated metal shack that served as an office. Hank was a small, wiry man with a permanent grease smudge across his nose and a cough that rattled deep in his lungs. He tossed a folded newspaper onto the truck's hood. Garrett didn't reach for it. He kept his eyes on the wrench. "I'm working off the debt, Hank. Don't push it." "I ain't pushing nothing." Hank sparked a bent cigarette, inhaling deeply. "But the cops are. Front page of the local section." Garrett finally looked up. He slid off the tailgate, his boots kicking up a cloud of dry, red dust. He picked up the paper. The headline was small, buried beneath an article about city council zoning. "Unknown Good Samaritan sought in child abuse case." Garrett scanned the text. Roxanne had been formally charged with attempted murder. Maisie was still in a medically induced coma, brain swelling. The police were heavily searching for the owner of the motorcycle club paraphernalia found at the scene, stating he was a person of interest. "They got your DNA, man," Hank said, blowing smoke into the heavy afternoon air. "They got your sweat on that leather. It's only a matter of time before it hits the national database. You need to get out of Nevada. Take the green Chevy by the crusher. The plates are clean. Just go." Garrett stared at the words on the cheap, gray paper, medically induced coma. He remembered the way her tiny chest hadn't been moving, the way her pink sneaker lay in the spilled gin. "I can't," Garrett rasped. "What do you mean you can't?" Hank coughed, a wet, ugly sound. "It's a kid, Garrett. It's tragic. The world is a meat grinder. But you step in the blades, you get chopped. You taught me that." "I need to borrow the truck," Garrett said, ignoring him. He threw the newspaper back onto the hood. "Just for a few hours. You go near Washoe Med, you're dead meat," Hank warned, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Place is crawling with uniforms." "Just the keys, Hank." 10 minutes later, Garrett was fighting the stiff steering wheel of a rusted-out flatbed, navigating the brutal afternoon traffic of downtown Reno. The truck's cabin smelled like stale beer and wet dog. The heater was stuck on, blasting hot, dusty air against Garrett's legs. He felt like he was suffocating. He didn't have a plan. Men like Garrett rarely did. They survived on instinct, violence, and momentum. But right now, his instinct was dragging him straight into the mouth of the wolf. He parked the flatbed in a dingy, concrete parking structure 2 blocks from the hospital. He pulled a faded baseball cap down low over his eyes. He had bought a cheap, oversized flannel shirt from a thrift store down the road, wearing it unbuttoned over his black t-shirt to hide his heavily tattooed arms. He looked like any other overworked, exhausted laborer in the city. The automatic doors of the hospital hissed open, hitting him with a wall of aggressively sterile air. It smelled of bleach, floor wax, and the underlying sour scent of human panic. Garrett kept his head down, navigating the bright, fluorescent-lit corridors with a slow, lumbering gait. He found the directory. Pediatric intensive care, 3rd floor. He took the stairs. The elevator was a cage, and Garrett didn't do cages. When he pushed the heavy fire door open on the 3rd floor, the atmosphere shifted. It was quieter here. The beeping of monitors echoed down the long, polished hallway. Nurses moved with hushed, urgent efficiency. Garrett stopped at the edge of the waiting area, lingering behind a fake, dusty ficus plant. Down the hall, outside room 312, sat a uniformed police officer. The cop was reading a magazine, looking bored. Garrett leaned against the wall. He couldn't see into the room. The blinds were drawn tight, but he knew she was in there. The silence of the hallway felt exactly like the silence in room 114 right before he kicked the door in. He closed his eyes, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "What are you doing here, old man? You can't fix this." "I don't care what the paperwork says. I need to see her." The voice snapped Garrett's eyes open. It wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a cop. A man was standing at the nurse's station, roughly 20 feet from Garrett. He wore a cheap, shiny gray suit that pulled too tight across his shoulders. His hair was slicked back with heavy pomade, and even from this distance, Garrett could smell the overpowering reek of cheap cologne, aquavelva, and stale tobacco. The head nurse, a stern woman with steel-rimmed glasses, crossed her arms. "Sir, only immediate family is allowed in the PICU. Her aunt is currently in police custody, and the child's father is not listed on any of her medical records." "I am her uncle," the man lied, his voice slick, laced with a dangerous impatience. "Roxanne's brother, Marcus." Garrett's eyes narrowed. The man shifted his weight, and as his jacket fell open, Garrett saw the unmistakable bulge of a compact firearm tucked into his waistband. This wasn't an uncle. Roxanne's shrill, terrified voice echoed in Garrett's memory. "Where is it? Where's the envelope?" Garrett knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at the reason Roxanne was frantic enough to beat a child into a coma over missing money. This was the bookie, the collector. And if he was here, trying to get into Maisie's room, it wasn't to bring balloons. It was to find out what the kid knew, or worse, use her as leverage against Roxanne to find his cash. The cop down the hall looked up from his magazine, his hand resting casually on his radio. The man in the suit noticed the cop. His jaw tightened. He offered the nurse a cold, artificial smile. "My mistake. I'll come back with my ID." He turned on his heel and walked rapidly toward the stairwell, passing within 5 feet of Garrett without sparing him a glance. Garrett stood perfectly still in the shadows. His blood, which had been running cold with paranoia for 3 days, suddenly burned hot. The police were looking for a biker, but they weren't looking for the man in the cheap suit. Garrett pushed himself off the wall. He didn't look at room 312. He just turned and followed the scent of stale tobacco into the stairwell, the heavy metal door clicking silently shut behind him. Concrete dust and the sharp chemical burn of floor wax hung thick in the stairwell. Garrett stood on the landing between the second and third floors, perfectly still, letting the shadows swallow his massive frame. Above him, the heavy fire door clicked shut. The rhythmic clack-clack-clack of leather-soled dress shoes began their descent. The man in the suit was moving fast, his footsteps echoing a tight, angry cadence against the cinder-block walls. He was muttering to himself, a low stream of bitter curses. Garrett didn't wait for him to reach the landing. He took 2 steps up, closed the distance, and hit the man like a freight train. There was no cinematic grace to it. It was just raw, blunt force physics. Garrett's shoulder drove directly into the man's sternum. The air left the bookie's lungs in a wet, tearing wheeze. They both went down hard, tumbling down the remaining 4 concrete steps. Knees struck unyielding stone. Fabric tore. The sharp, copper scent of blood instantly bloomed in the confined space. They crashed onto the landing. The suit scrambled, panicked and desperate. His manicured hands clawed at his waistband, fingers fumbling for the cold steel of the compact pistol. Garrett's heavy work boot came down directly on the man's wrist. A sickening, wet pop echoed through the stairwell. The suit screamed a high, reedy sound that bounced off the painted walls. The gun slipped from his paralyzed fingers, clattering loudly down the metal grating of the next flight of stairs. Garrett dropped his full weight onto the man's chest, pinning him against the dusty concrete. He grabbed a handful of the cheap, shiny lapels, twisting the fabric tight, pulling the man's face up until their noses almost touched. The overpowering stench of aquavelva and stale tobacco made Garrett's stomach roll. "You're not an uncle," Garrett rasped. His breath was ragged, his injured ribs screaming from the impact. The man choked, spitting a thick wad of bloody saliva onto Garrett's flannel shirt. "You're him, the biker. You're a dead man. The cops are right upstairs." "Let him look," Garrett's voice dropped, becoming a low, gravelly vibration that rattled in the man's chest. "You listen to me, and you listen close. You're a debt collector. You bleed junkies for pennies. But that little girl upstairs, she doesn't owe you a dime." The man squeezed his eyes shut, his face pale and shining with a cold sweat, his broken wrist pinned awkwardly against his side. "If you come back to this hospital," Garrett tightened his grip, leaning his forearm across the man's throat. "If you send someone else, if I even think you looked at her file, I won't just beat you. I will find where you sleep. Nod, if you understand." The suit tried to swallow, his Adam's apple bobbing uselessly against Garrett's heavy forearm. He gave a frantic, jerky nod. Garrett released him, standing up with a heavy groan. He didn't look back. He walked down to the lower landing, picked up the drop pistol, ejected the magazine, and dumped the live rounds through the gap in the stairwell. They clattered uselessly into the dark basement levels below. He tossed the empty gun into a nearby trash bin. He climbed back up to the third floor. His chest heaved. His hands were shaking again. He cracked the fire door open just an inch. The hallway was empty. The uniformed officer who had been sitting outside room 312 was gone, likely called away by the head nurse to deal with the fake uncle's missing ID. The plastic chair sat vacant. Garrett slipped through the door. He had maybe 60 seconds. He moved silently across the polished linoleum, his heavy boots making barely a sound. He pushed the heavy wooden door to room 312 inward and stepped inside. The room was dim, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of medical monitors. It smelled of iodine, sterilized cotton, and the faint, heartbreaking scent of baby shampoo. The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of a ventilator dominated the silence. Maisie looked impossibly small. She was lost in the center of the mechanical hospital bed, a thick, white bandage wrapped completely around her head. The bruising that had been purple in the motel room was now a sickly, spreading yellow across her pale cheeks. Tubes snaked from her arms, connecting her to bags of clear fluid. Her chest rose and fell artificially, forced up by the machine beside her. Garrett stood at the foot of the bed. He didn't cry. He wasn't the crying type, but a massive, crushing weight settled directly on his lungs, making it hard to draw air. He looked at her hands. They were resting on top of the pristine white sheet, completely still. No scuffed pink sneakers, no dust, just a broken child trapped in a sterile cage. He reached into his jeans pocket. His thick, calloused fingers brushed against a small piece of metal. It was a heavy, silver St. Christopher medal, worn smooth around the edges. He had carried it in his pocket through 4 years of state lockup, through countless miles of barren asphalt, through knife fights and frozen nights. It was the only clean thing he owned. Garrett stepped to the side of the bed. He placed the silver medal carefully on the rolling tray, right next to a plastic cup of water she couldn't drink. "You fight, kid," Garrett whispered to the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. "You don't let this be the end. The world's ugly, but it ain't all heavy hands and broken doors. You fight." Footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, heavy, authoritative strides. Garrett backed away into the shadows. He slipped out the adjoining door that led into a supply closet, navigating the tight space blindly until he hit the secondary exit. 20 minutes later, the rusted flatbed truck rattled to life in the concrete parking structure. Garrett steered it onto the highway, pointing the heavy grill south toward the barren, open stretch of the Nevada desert. The sun was beginning to set, painting the jagged mountains in bruised shades of purple and red. He rolled the window down, letting the hot, dry wind scour his face. He was a ghost again, a man with no colors, no name, and a warrant on his head. But as the miles rolled by, the phantom weight of a small, cold hand finally lifted from his shoulders. Garrett's story isn't a neat, sanitized fairy tale. It's a brutal reminder that heroes rarely wear capes sometimes. They wear grease-stained denim and carry a violent past they can't outrun. Did Garrett do the right thing, or did he just add to the world's chaos? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this raw, unfiltered story hit you hard, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a reality check, and subscribe for more unvarnished storytelling.